good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with news that Datin Sri Rosmah Mansor failed to turn up for the first day of her corruption trial at the KL High Court this afternoon. Now, this trial is in relation to a solar project for schools in Sarawak, and Rosmah is accused of soliciting and accepting about 187 million ringgit. This to ensure a company from Bintulu that allegedly rented out cars won a contract to install and maintain solar power systems at 369 schools in Sarawak. So Rosmah gave an MC, and that MC was issued by the KPJ Ampang Putri Specialist Hospital, which had referenced her previous visits for severe recurrent neck pain. So there you go. She's got a medical certificate to get out of trial.
Oh, yeah, but only for a short while, Melissa. There's several things in the mix that, and I think you pointed out very clearly that this is a corruption trial that deals with schools. Allocations for schools and for rural schools. The poorest of the poor, the most disadvantaged of Malaysians, subject to potentially or allegedly corruption that would have diminished their chances, right? So resources that would have gone otherwise to the schools now taken as a cut. Now, the facts of this case aside, Melissa, not prejudging it, the issue really is before us is the nature of corruption. I'm hoping that the trial of Rosmah Mansor, the trial of Najib Razak, the trial of all those individuals that the MACC is now catching will give us a greater insight into the nature of corruption in this country. What are the enablers?
Right. And
who has suffered most as a consequence of corruption in this country?
Well, one of the things that struck me the most about the charges in this case is that, again, this 187 million ringgit in a bribes for contract scandal. Just it struck me because this is to do with the Education Ministry. And I was wondering how much influence the wife of the Prime Minister would have over contracts within the Education Ministry. That was one of the lingering questions I have, and I will be watching this trial quite closely.
Yeah, and I think, of course, we look to the media to focus on the important issues. I know there's a lot of hay to be made. Quite a number of jokes that will be passed around coffee tables and a lunchtime conversation around the kinds of excuses, the repartee between the lawyers and all that. But that's actually not the heart of the problem. Right? The heart of the problem is corruption in this country, people in very high places abusing their power to enrich themselves.
Understanding how it works and how we can stop it. All right, well, let's move on now to news of a 38-year-old disabled man who yesterday was sentenced to 6 months in prison by the Magistrates Court in Kuala Terengganu. This for his attempt on suicide on the 23rd of December. So two rights groups, Lawyers for Liberty and Hakam, have called on the Attorney General to review the sentence because I think it was interesting about the case. Several points to note here is that first, the man had pleaded guilty, but he was not represented by a lawyer. Second, the prosecution was conducted by a senior police officer instead of a deputy public prosecutor. And thirdly, the report said the man was depressed. So we have to really look at the country's move towards decriminalizing suicide.
Yeah, there's that. There's also a very interesting fact. When we look back at the Rosmah Mansor case, Melissa, there's the judge expressed some generosity in terms of this person now who's in the dock giving her space to people get ill and so on and so forth. But I don't know how much generosity is afforded to the working class who find themselves, individuals who find themselves in the dock and trial for all kinds of issues, right?
Yeah.
How much generosity does our legal system give to them as opposed to the high rollers and high flyers of this country? I think that's one. The other thing, of course, is, and you're right about the decriminalizing aspect of this issue, which is that, Melissa, why is it that suicide in the first place is a criminal act. How did it become criminal to take your own life?
Well,
Not to take the life of others, but your own life.
I think this is an archaic law, and I think Malaysia is one of the few countries still retaining this archaic law in our statute books. I had something to do about preserving the sanctity of life, doing no harm, and I think it comes from that train of thought. But just to follow on to that discussion about decriminalising attempted suicide, the government is committed to this. Apparently, the de facto law minister, Datuk Liew Vu Kong, said that the government is working to table the amendments to the penal code by mid this year. So we are looking at perhaps decriminalising suicide and, in fact, approaching suicide not as a crime, but rather a mental health problem.
Yeah. So the question, that you might ask, have read this article in the newspaper, is did the presiding judge, have the opportunity to not hand down a custodial sentence? Could the judge have, in fact, sent the person off for psychiatric evaluation and dealt with it that way?
Yeah.
I mean, were the hands of the judge tied, or was the judge animated or by some other notion? Did he or she think that what they were doing was in fact the right way to go about it, deal with somebody who had attempted suicide?
Good point. Could be the letter of the law. Now, I have to point out that, talking about this story, that if you are lonely, distressed, or having negative thoughts, Befrienders offers free and confidential support 24 hours a day. We're going to flash the number on the screen. Please contact them at the number on the screen if you are feeling distressed and you need someone to talk to. All right, so in other news, let's take a look now at the latest on the coronavirus. So far, 362 people have died from the novel coronavirus as of Monday, February 3rd. So the death in the Philippines, which was reported yesterday, marks the first death from the virus outside of China. The patient was a 44-year-old man from Wuhan who died 8 days after being admitted to the hospital. So far, there are currently about 17,500 confirmed cases in 27 countries.
Yeah, and I think, Melissa, with all these numbers, one has to step back and take a comparative perspective, right? So look at the avian flu, look at all these other outbreaks that have gone global, and look at infection rates, the number of people affected, mortality rates, and then maybe we come to a much more considered position on how bad this situation is. Now, yes, everybody's concerned, but I think panic as often is the worst response to this.
Completely agree.
Yeah, we all know that you wear a mask not when you're well, you wear a mask only if you're sick because you don't want to transmit. Wearing a mask does not, in fact, have a prophylactic quality. It doesn't protect you from catching the disease. So why wear a mask? If
you don't have flu-like symptoms, don't wear a mask. In fact, what you should be doing, more importantly, is making sure you wash your hands regularly with soap. I also want to just make a note here that the number of novel coronaviruses confirmed cases here in Malaysia has stayed at 8 since Thursday, and I think that's a good sign. And apparently, our neighbours in Thailand have had some apparent success in treatment with an antiviral drug cocktail. So a 71-year-old patient had tested negative for the virus 48 hours after doctors administered a combination of antivirals which were used to treat the flu as well as HIV. So perhaps that's some positive news coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, yeah, there you go, the PHICE. Okay, after this, we're going to take a closer look at the possibility of a PPSMI revival. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Now, last Thursday, during a special meeting with the Education Ministry, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who is now Acting Education Minister, had reportedly talked about reinstating the policy of teaching and learning science and mathematics in English, or better known as PPSMI. Now, Mahathir's remarks at the meeting was uploaded on his official YouTube account on Friday. However, it does not mention how or when the new teaching policy would be implemented. So to discuss this further, we have joining us on the line Professor Ganakumaran Subramaniam, Head of the School of Education at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Prof. Gana, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, could you begin by clarifying this policy? Is this policy about improving competency in English or improving competency in science and mathematics?
Thank you for having me on the show. I think at this moment we aren't sure whether it's going to be a policy or whether it's going to be a program. Because currently we have going on the dual language program, so we're really not sure what's going to happen with this. But hearing what the Prime Minister said, and also the kind of news that's come out since, it appears to be a model that reflects closely the PPSMI, or the teaching of mathematics and science and English. And if that's the case, and again, these are the points that have been raised, that teaching maths and science and English would be useful to improve the quality of English in the country, but also because studying these subjects in English would then allow our students to access knowledge or current knowledge in the subject, or in the subject or in the field. So these are the points that have been raised. I'm not sure which is first, which is the priority, improving English or accessing current knowledge in the field.
So, as somebody who's a former teacher and now, as an educationist, what do you think are the weaknesses that this policy is supposed to address? Surely that would be the reason to have a new program or have a new policy orientation. There's a problem or there's a crisis or something's not happening, and therefore we need to change the way we're doing things now. What is the problem?
I'm not sure what's the problem. I think the problem largely is in English. The fact that, the country is not performing up to the level that, we wanted to perform. All the students are not performing to that level. PPSMI or math and science seems to be the subject that is favored to act as a context to improve the language, while at the same time, acquiring the skills in math and science and English. So that is where this seems to be coming from, based on PISA scores where, we fall below the PISA average, global average, perhaps even, the TIMSS results in the country. So these are probably where the anxieties are coming from for the implementation of a policy like this.
I like what you pointed out, Gana, a little bit earlier in saying that, where is the priority, right? There seems to be a little bit of policy confusion. So is it in improving English, or is it in giving access to current knowledge in the field of maths and science? Your personal opinion, what do you think is the priority?
Well, I don't know. But when we look at research in the field, not much research is done. In fact, perhaps, we are also following what some of the other countries are doing. Quite a lot of countries are doing this English medium of instruction thing. And there's some research available in terms of how successful this approach is. Where language development is considered, results or research shows that in 4 years of using English as a medium of instruction for any subject, maths and science or any other subject, the increase in language proficiency is only perhaps up to 0.5 in the IELTS score. So it's really not that high, for us to move or shift only 0.5 based on the IELTS scale. On the other hand, if we took language as it is and did an extensive, intensive English program, it would probably take about 12 weeks to get up to that level of improvement. So
that's considerable.
So where language is itself is concerned. So this perhaps is not the way to go to improve English, according to research.
Gunnar, so let's focus on English, because I think a lot of the sympathy for this program is feeling that somehow this is a way to improve English, right? And parents are desperate for their children to gain that competency. How is the standards, or what are the standards of language education, English language classes in our schools today? Is it appalling? Or is it bad? Or should we disaggregate the schools so that we have a clearer sense of where English is being taught well and where it's not being taught well?
I think the Ministry of Education, credit to it, did a large-scale study in terms of benchmarking the kind of English language competence in Malaysian schools. And they found, of course, a disparity between urban and rural schools. They found, that perhaps our students are not meeting the levels, in general terms, to students in sort of developed countries or globally. So then what they did was they brought in this, this global benchmark called the CFR, the Common European Framework, and then created an English language roadmap, which said that students in primary schools need to achieve a certain level of competency. Students in secondary school have got different targets to achieve. At pre-university level, different target, and at university level, different targets. So the ministry has done these things in trying to improve English language competence among our students. Apart from that, they've also brought in curriculum change. They've also brought in programs to support the growth, programs like the highly immersive programs to support reaching these targets for languages concerned. Unfortunately, we have not given these programs enough time to show results. These are relatively new programs.
How much time do you think is a realistic time frame for such a policy implementation?
Oh, I think anything between 5 to 10 years would be, a suitable time, because you need to allow time for people to, understand the policy, understand the way it should be implemented, and the subjects be taught. So you need to give time for these things. At this stage, even if we are talking about teaching of maths and science and English, we are not ready. Though we have been doing the dual language program for some time now, but the dual language program is not for all students. It's for selected students in selected schools. It is not even in every school in the country.
Well, Gunnar, of course, when it comes to time, politicians are thinking in terms of electoral cycles. 5 to 10 years is 2 electoral cycles, or 1 or 2, depending on if it's 5 or 10. The question is, is our education policy driven essentially by political considerations rather than pedagogical ones, the ones that you pointed to? And where do we go if, in fact, politics and not a sense of how education ought to be is driving our policy?
I think the drive to, sort of enhance mathematics and science in Malaysia, or increase the number of students who take up mathematics and science in Malaysia is something that's driven from a vision. The country wants to be there among the developing nations in terms of progress, particularly in the 21st century. Considering the needs of education 4.0. So there is a vision to have the country there together with other developing progressive countries. And I think this vision, started a long time ago with our current Prime Minister, but perhaps at that time, the time was really not right. People not ready for it. So now we see it coming again, but I don't think, the system is ready for it. Yes, so we need time to prepare the system to implement a program like this and to have any hope of it succeeding.
All right, well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight and sharing those insights with us. We're going to be back with more on Consider This. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you tonight. Here's what we want you to consider tonight. The BAFTA Awards happened early this morning, and actor Joaquin Phoenix won the Best Actor Award for Joker. And in his acceptance speech, he called out the systemic racism in the film industry. Here's part of his speech.
I think that it is the obligation of the people that have created and perpetuate and benefit from a system of oppression to be the ones that dismantle it. So that's on us. Thank you.
So that was Joaquin Phoenix at the BAFTA Awards. If you notice from that clip, he walked away from the podium without actually accepting or taking his Best Actor Award with him. I think in a sign of protest that that not a single person of color was nominated in the BAFTA acting categories at all.
Well, I'm sure there were some people clicking their fingers, kind of one of those woke gestures. I must say, this is really complex, right? Because the question is, if the lineup happens this year not to include people of color, was it because the movies that were stunning or value didn't in fact have scripts that included a whole range of people? Was it because of some nefarious agenda by, or was it just happenstance? It's very hard to tell, but what I do think Joaquin Phoenix does is to call out his own privilege. And I think that is something that's perhaps valuable, recognizing your privilege and demanding of yourself, one, to stop your complicity in a system that perhaps is unfair, but also strive to re-engineer it or to reconfigure it so that it is fairer.
I mean, that is really precisely, the words that really resonated with me is the obligation of the people that have created and perpetuated and benefited from a system of oppression must be the ones to dismantle it. And that's exactly what you talked about, recognizing the privilege. But really, how many of us want to dismantle a system that benefits your privilege, right?
Yeah, but also I think if we go back to Ricky Gervais, the comedian, and his emceeing of another celebrity driven event where
Golden Globes, I think that was,
where he actually calls out and warns the august crowd not to indulge in this woke type of speechifying, because he feels that it's in some ways quite empty and hypocritical. Now, between what Ricky Gervais says and what something like what Joaquin Phoenix does, well, I think we all had to find our own way, isn't it? I mean, in terms of recognizing if there is truly a problem, rather than constantly, waving flags. I think it's one of the things that happens. Or
using that podium as a soapbox. All right. Well, that's what we want you to consider tonight, and that's all the time we have for this episode of Consider This. We'll be back with you same time tomorrow. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutan, signing off. Thank you for watching, and good night.